Good afternoon. We are coming to our concluding session, and I have the great pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister Tony Blair, back in Davos. I don't have to introduce you, Prime Minister, so I would just say you take the floor because we are full of expectations for your speech.
Thank you very much indeed, Klaus, and it's a very great honor to be asked to speak to the Davos Forum at this closing session. Now, as you know, this will be my last Davos Forum as Prime Minister, so I look forward to coming back in future years and telling other leaders where they went wrong and how easy the job is. And you know, despite the actually, I want to start on this note. Despite the multiple challenges we face in the world today, I am optimistic. Mind you, in my job, you've got to be. But I think there's been a tremendous spirit about the forum. I've sensed that in the time I've been here. I think it's wonderful, for example, that there was such a constructive meeting on the Middle East and such a good atmosphere around the talks on trade, and it's wonderful news that they're going to restart the WTO talks in a comprehensive manner. That's a great thing, and congratulations to everyone who's participated in that. You know, each of the issues that has dominated Davos, in particular world trade and climate change in Africa, each of those issues hangs in the balance, but on each there is a progress that would have been unimaginable even a short time back. And what I'd like to do in my address to you today is to state where I think we are on each issue, then give a broader context for the optimism I've just outlined, and then end with an analysis of what we have to do. On world trade, within the past few days, not merely have we had the meeting here, but I've had discussions with President Bush, President Lula, Chancellor Merkel. And we had a great discussion with the trade ministers under Pascal Lamy's expert eye yesterday. Cautious optimism was how it was described. And I think with the announcement today that it is now more likely than not, though by no means certain, that we will reach a deal within the next few months. Countries are moving closer together. There is a reignition of political energy and drive, and an increased recognition of the dire consequences of failure. A trade deal would be a big boost to the notion of multilateralism, help the world's poorest escape their poverty, and achieve an impact on overall trade and business 3 times the amount of the last trade round. This is a critical priority for me in the coming period, and that determination, I'm pleased to say, is shared by other major players in the negotiation. And of course, Africa would be a central beneficiary of such a deal. Again, it's sometimes too easy to be pessimistic about Africa. But just think of what progress there has been. HIV/AIDS treatment now being given to 1.6 million people, $100 billion of debt wiped out, enabling countries like Tanzania, whose president is here, to transform primary education, 50 democratic elections in Africa in the last 5 years, and 6 major wars have ended. And it isn't any coincidence, and it's a wonderful thing that we've had the President of Liberia here with us these past few days. We made commitments, not least on aid, at the Gleneagles G8 Summit in July 2005. We must honour them. We will have the first meeting of the Africa Progress Panel, which will monitor our commitments under Kofi Annan's leadership in Berlin later this year. And of course, the other topic at the top of the Gleneagles agenda was climate change. Kyoto was an extraordinary achievement, over 100 countries coming to an agreement with profound implications for their future economic growth. But in reality, even if implemented, and Britain is one of the few nations that will hit, indeed exceed, our Kyoto targets, in reality, even if we did Kyoto, it would only stabilise emissions. In truth, we need them cut, probably by an order of 60% by 2050, something we have now set as a UK domestic target. Moreover, whatever we do, Britain accounts for around 2% of total emissions. Any agreement that does not have binding commitments from America, China and India is not one that can deliver. You know, if Britain shut down our emissions entirely, i.e. we closed down the country, not the legacy I want, the growth in China's emissions would make up the difference within just 2 years. Without the biggest economies being part of a framework to reduce carbon dependence, we have no earthly hope of success. Fortunately, I believe as a result of recent developments, we are potentially on the verge of a breakthrough. Chancellor Merkel is providing excellent G8 leadership. China and India are participating constructively in the G8+5 process that Gleneagles established. They know that they will suffer if the environment degrades further. They have every imperative to be part of a deal, provided it is one that allows them to grow their economies so they can spread the prosperity they are creating to the millions in those countries still in poverty. And the mood in the United States, I think, is in the process of a quantum shift. The President's State of the Union address built on his addiction to oil speech last year and set the first US targets for a reduction in petrol consumption. Many individual American states, notably California, with whose governor I signed a bilateral agreement on this subject last year, the only, or one of the few world leaders I feel body envy when I'm standing alongside. States like California are setting targets for reducing emissions and also taking far-reaching action to achieve them. It's fantastic that we have Senator John McCain here with us, who's played such a major role in driving this agenda forward in the United States. So I think in politics, and of course with American businesses, many of them the key power companies who are leading this debate in America, we are well on our way. The German G8 presidency, therefore, gives us an opportunity to agree at least the principles of a new binding international agreement to come into effect when the Kyoto Protocol expires in 2012. But one which is more radical than Kyoto and more comprehensive, one which this time includes all the major countries of the world. It is a prize of tantalizing significance, and I do believe it's within our grasp. So across all of these issues, there are signs of hope. But this is part of a bigger shift in the politics of the global community. And it is in this shift that the real possibilities of progress lie. What is really happening is that nations, even the most great, are realizing that they cannot pursue their narrow national interests without invoking broader global values. They are obliged to recognize that interdependence is the defining characteristic of the early 21st century. These topics, which have dominated Davos in 2007, all of them are global in their impact, their political relevance, and in their prospective solutions. The shifting power equation, the title of Davos this year, is in part, obviously, about emerging new powers. But it is equally about the fact that power over global issues can only be effectively wielded today by global alliances, in turn based on global values. You know, there's this curious mix today in politics of moral cause and strategic interest. We know we have a clear interest, of course, in combating climate change, but we feel it too as a moral duty to successive generations as well as our own. Business is here in Davos, not simply to talk about information technology or commerce or industrial trends, but also about its role in tackling the great issues of the day. Business has moved way beyond traditional notions of corporate responsibility. Business believes that it too has a strategic interest in the moral cause. The world today is a kind of perpetual global conversation. Campaigns are begun and intensified almost instantly. Tragedy or injustice, like war, leaps into our living rooms, assaulting our senses, bringing us to a judgment on events that may be thousands of miles away, but of which we, as human beings, feel a part. This can happen in a malign way, as when an atavistic terrorist ideology uses the internet to recruit or proselytize, or in a benign way, as the magnificent Live Aid showed in awakening the conscience of the world over Africa. But either way, it's a reality, and it is having a profound impact. Individuals become part of mass movements for change and action. Political leaders find that the time quotient between foreign and domestic affairs alters dramatically. Business gets involved in politics not as partisans of a political party, but as important actors in global debate. And above all, nations find that they need to confront and deal with challenges that simply do not admit of resolution without powerful alliances of other nations. And every nation, even the most powerful, is obliged to find such alliances or find their own interests buffeted and diminished. That's why we call it interdependence. It is the ultimate joining together of self-interest and community interest. Afghanistan was a failed state, its people living in misery and poverty. But in days gone by, it would have stayed that way without the world much noticing. September the 11th brought it to our notice in the most unforeseen but catastrophic way. And look how the world has changed because of those events. We know Africa's plight is shameful in a world of plenty. But I personally have never shrunk from confessing another motive for action. I believe if we let Somalia or Sudan slip further into the abyss, the effect of their fall will not stay within their region, never mind their nation. I will argue for the presence of peace in Palestine on its own terms. But there is no question but that its absence has consequences on the streets of cities, even in Britain, amongst people who've never been anywhere near the Gaza or the West Bank. And of course there is climate change. Assume even a possibility of its threat being real. It would be madness not to act to prevent its realization, just as a precaution. Its challenge is the supreme expression of this interdependence. America and China, even if they had no other reason for a relationship, and they have many, would need one simply for this alone. To this add economic globalization, which offers, in general, such immense opportunity, but whose effects in particular can be random and savage. So, just take these three issues: climate change, Africa, world trade. Work out what is at stake: the future of the planet, the death or life of millions of people every year, the ability to spread the life chances of globalization, the single greatest economic engine of our time, more evenly. Consider what is at stake in these issues. Then consider how hard we have found it to put the right alliances in place, to reach agreement, and to take the appropriate measures to get the job done. This is my major reflection on 10 years of trying to meet these challenges. 10 years in which, as a deliberate policy, Britain has been at the forefront, for better or worse, of each of these major global issues. Interdependence is an accepted fact, I believe. It is giving rise to a great yearning for a sense of global purpose, underpinned by global values, to overcome challenges global in nature. But we are woefully short of the instruments to make multilateral action effective. In other words, we acknowledge the interdependent reality, we can sketch the purpose, and we can describe the values. What we lack is capacity, capability, the concerted means to act in furtherance of our purpose. We need a multilateralism that is muscular. Instead, too often, it is disjointed, imbued with the right ideas, but the wrong or inadequate methods of achieving them. None of this should make us underestimate, incidentally, what has been done. There have been great achievements, but there is too often a yawning gap between our description of an issue's importance and the matching capability to determine it. In this regard, there is often an easy, in my view, rather lazy critique that puts this down to an absence of political will. As a political leader, I obviously resent that. Next year, as I say, it may be different. But in my experience, actually dealing with this over 10 years, there is usually, sometimes there is, but usually there is not a problem of political will. By and large, it's there. It's translating that will into action that is the problem. And why? Because it requires focus, time, energy, and commitment. And though individual leaders and nations can provide these qualities intermittently, sustaining them over time with all the other pressures is just practically impossible. Global purpose, therefore, underpinned by global values, requires global instruments of effective multilateral action. Now, how do we achieve it? Well, a United Nations Security Council without Germany, Japan, Brazil, or India, to say nothing of any African or Muslim nation, as permanent members, will in time not merely lose legitimacy in the eyes of the world, but seriously inhibit effective action. By all means, let us have some form of bridging mechanism, perhaps semi-permanent status without a veto, to a reformed council. But we should get it done. Likewise, with reform within the UN, greater power to the Secretary General, merging agencies, one UN organisation in country. But reform now has to happen. I think there is a powerful case for merging the IMF and the World Bank and for increasing the influence of the developing countries within them. The G8 is already well on its way to metamorphosis into the G8 plus 5. At G8 plus 5, it can be a forum for agreement between the most powerful nations with a true modern global reach. But sooner or later, the metamorphosis should be complete. We need to make the regional blocs more effective. I strongly believe in changing the rules of the European Union to build efficacy in Europe's power. A Europe at 27 simply cannot operate within the system designed for a Europe of 15. I believe it would hugely help the cause of Africa if the Africa Union became a strong and cohesive voice and a proper instrument of Africa's interests. However, this is not just about government institutions. The interesting thing about developments over the past few years is that into the void between identifying an issue's importance and securing the means of acting on it has stepped increasingly the non-governmental and non-state actors. The resource of the Gates Foundation is being put to the eradication of malaria, a preventable disease which kills 1 million a year. The Grameen Bank, founded by Mohammed Yunus, has pioneered microcredit projects which now have over 80 million recipients, the vast majority of them women. It is a partnership between governments, private markets, NGOs and faith groups that is providing immunisation that will save over the years to come 5 million children's lives and the lives of 5 million adults. The agenda on climate change is, as we've seen, increasingly driven by coalitions of business, most recently the group of US companies, calling for tougher action, but also setting out practical ways of doing it. All of this, I think, is exciting, it's great, groundbreaking work. But in a sense, It is laying bare the paucity of the instruments to effect change which we have at our disposal. In 1999 in Chicago, I called for a doctrine of international community in which we accept that a modern foreign policy cannot work except on the basis of shared common values. These values gave us not just a right but a duty to act in order to protect people at risk. I meant it, of course, in the context of Kosovo, an ethnic cleansing. But the application goes far wider. The common theme that runs through such apparently disparate issues like the struggle against terrorism or poverty in Africa is that both require active measures of intervention. Indeed, the very consequence, if we think about it, of interdependence is the necessity to intervene in coalition with others in order to prevent danger or injustice that may originate outside of our borders, but ultimately will affect us within our borders. So today we see the establishment of a proper democratic state of Palestine as benefiting not just Palestine and Israel, but the wider Middle East and the world. We know too that if Central Africa is given over to conflict, it will at some stage be a global threat. Likewise, if Iraq or Afghanistan falls back into failed states exporting violence, we are all going to suffer the impact. But we know also that these desirable objectives cannot happen without our active intervention. Now, we are familiar, me as much as anyone, with military intervention. The path of aid and development is, in a sense, well trodden. But the concept of nation building, by which I mean the construction of the capacity for effective self-government within a country, is still in its infancy. The proper infrastructure of government, the things that we in countries like my own take for granted, functioning commercial and legal systems, health and education ministries that can actually administer, economic authorities that have real authority, police and military that perform the tasks they should under proper rules of governance. These things may seem less exciting and motivating than direct intervention to cure disease or alleviate poverty. But in reality, they are the lifeblood of true progress for nations that are struggling to be nations. Aid for trade is at least as important as any other part of the world trade deal. Why? Because it builds capacity. There is a whole new dimension to international intervention, therefore, that needs development. It is in building the capacity that the fate of Palestine, Iraq, or Afghanistan, or any of the poorest or war-ravaged African nations will obtain their salvation. Everything else, worthy, essential though it is, fails unless systems of self-government and therefore self-help are brought into being. These, in my view, are the new skills the international community must develop. There is a further element to it. We need proper, well-constructed means of conflict resolution and peacekeeping. What is happening in Darfur today is a scandal. It's not a problem, it is a scandal. Hundreds of thousands of people die or live lives of unbelievable risk and misery because we cannot assemble a proper peace agreement, properly enforced, with the full weight of the international community behind it. Now, I know there are a host of political reasons that are colliding with our good intent. But the real problem, again, is the absence of a sustained international focus with the capacity to keep at it, report back credibly, and trigger effective action if nothing happens. Not all of this requires us to go back to traditional institutions of international governance like the United Nations. Non-state actors can play a role here too. But my point is very simple. If we are to intervene successfully, we have to have the capability of doing so. Therefore, a key and new part of our international dialogue must be the strengthening of the instruments and institutions, those between governments, but also those within broader civic society, that can build capacity. We need new networks, new relationships between countries and between people, which mobilize the practical means of bringing the changes we want into being. Finally, there is an urgency here. What is remarkable about Davos this year, and this has been true for some years now, is actually the degree of consensus around a values-based international agenda. It's what makes me optimistic. There is a true sense of global responsibility. But ours is not the only narrative competing for the world's attention. There is another. It is based on a total perversion of Islam, but it has shown itself capable of playing cleverly on the injustice, poverty and alienation felt by many whose lifestyles are a world away from ours. We believe that we are doing our best to confront the world's problems and to lift the scourge from the backs of so many millions whose lives are blighted. But make no mistake, this counter-ideology mocks our efforts, disputes our motives, turns our good faith into bad. And there is yet another narrative. In 20 years or sooner, there will be new powers, new constellations of authority, with strong intentions and powerful means of advancing them. What values will govern that new world? Will they be global values, commonly shared, or will the world revert to spheres of interest, to competing power plays in which the lesser or struggling nations are the victims? If the narrative we believe in, we here, a world of tolerance, freedom, openness and justice for all, is to be credible, it has to be effective. The best answer to fear is always hope. But hope requires belief. And belief comes only from words that are turned into deeds. So, finally, take these issues: Africa, climate change, world trade. Imagine, over the coming months, the world agrees, and over the coming years, it acts. Think then how attractive our story of the world's progress would be. Then think of failure and who will weep and who will rejoice. Think of all of this. Then let us agree, and then let us act. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We have some time for a dialogue. Who would like to take the floor? Comments or questions? You see, here's one.
Peter Schwartz from the Monitor Group. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for your speech. Climate change. A few years ago, I authored a report on abrupt climate change for the Pentagon, which I think you noticed, and talked about changes in Britain. Recently, you took a rather dramatic decision to revive nuclear power in Britain. Here, we've debated some of these issues. You have a very, very strong environmental lobby, very strong green force in Britain and in the rest of Europe. What are you going to say to the Greens to revive nuclear power?
Oh, I should think I'll persuade them fairly easily. I think, you know, maybe this is a problem of the length of time I've been in office, but you realise there are sometimes, you know, you're not going to be able to please all of the people all of the time. In fact, my ambition nowadays is to please some of the people at least some of the time. But it's, you know, I just look at this issue and say, how can we tackle the issue of climate change and also energy security without nuclear power being part of the mix? Now, as well as nuclear power, we are going dramatically to increase our investment in renewable energy, in energy efficiency. You know, we have been instrumental in creating the European emissions trading system. We're about to publish a climate change bill in the next few weeks, which will be some very radical measures in that to allow individuals and businesses to help in all this. But I look ahead in my country and I see a situation where we're going to move, incidentally, from self-sufficiency in gas to importing 90% of it. And I say, for reasons of both energy security and reducing carbon emissions, how are we going to do that without nuclear energy being part of the mix? And I think we've got to get over this, you know, this. I mean, I'm afraid what I think is really a quite false view that it offers nothing by way of the future. I think there is a whole new generation of technology growing up around it. It's interesting to me that in different parts of the world, I think there's probably 60 or 70 nuclear power stations to be built in the next period of time. And, you know, I'm a great respecter of NGOs, but I mean, this is another thing I've kind of learned from my time, which is that pressure groups have a really important part to play, but in the end, the leaders of country have got to take the responsibility of doing the right thing irrespective of the pressure put on them, and try to do it on a rational basis. And personally, I don't think we are going to tackle climate change effectively or energy security unless nuclear is part of the mix. That's my belief.
My name is Sigmund Sternberg. I'm the co-founder of the Three-Phase Forum, the Christian, Jewish, Muslim dialogue group, to which you have given a great deal of help and a great deal of encouragement. And so was Professor Schwab, when I approached him 8 years ago to set up a section dealing with interfaith dialogue. Over the last 7 years, 100 religious leaders came to the forum. Now we have established a dialogue between Christian, Jews and Muslims. We call it C100. Probably not many of you know what C100 is, because the press is just not interested in the topic. My question to you is, once you give up your high office, will you continue working to the dialogue between the various faiths? Because you are the right person who can do it. Had you not been a prime minister, you would have definitely been a cleric.
I don't know whether that generous applause is because many of you wish that I had been. I actually believe this issue of dialogue between the faiths is very important, because I think that there is a kind of mythological assumption behind a lot of the debate about terrorism and how we defeat it, that for perfectly understandable reasons wants to say, look, this isn't really an issue of religion, this is really an issue of terrorism. And of course, it is an issue of terrorism, but one cannot simply eliminate from your understanding of it the fact that a lot of this terrorism is based on, albeit a complete perversion of the proper faith of Islam, but it is based on it. And I also think that the degree of ignorance that there is, not just between the Abrahamic faiths, the Jewish and the Christian and Muslim faiths, but also more broadly, is a serious issue for us in the modern world. And I think that as political ideology, I mean, the 20th century was a great century of competing political ideology. I think the 21st century will be about far more about how we create the right bonds of tolerance and mutual respect in civic society. I think we'll have a different type of debate. And into that, the work that C100 and interfaith dialogue does will be very, very important indeed. So I think, and some of the answers to this, you know, I say to people in my own country, some of the answers to the extremism that's being peddled in communities is to have proper scholars of the Quran and clerics who will go in there and argue the case. And you can't just ignore the importance of that because there are other people going in and giving them a warped version. So I think this is really, really important. And it's kind of also why I think the issue to do with Palestine, of course, is important in its own right. But I've always thought it's got a symbolic importance far beyond its borders. Now, I know that can disconcert people, I think, sometimes. And in particular, I think people in the region sometimes worry that, you know, we're interested in it for something other than its own sake. But I do believe that interfaith dialogue also is one major part of bringing about peace in Palestine. And I do not, I've never wavered from my notion that there's probably no other single more important thing than peace in Palestine in bringing the world together.
Catherine Bennett, Herald Tribune. Mr. Prime Minister, I was interested in your thoughts on institutional reform in the world. One thing in the last few years when people have sat down and tried to reform some of the most important institutions has been a problem is a lack of American leadership, in part perhaps due to a certain amount of decline in its moral authority in the world. But the other part of the problem has been a lack in sort of European initiative. Europe certainly has not stepped up to the plate, in part because it has its own institutional troubles at home. Could you conceive of a bolder Europe in future, perhaps even going to the point of suggesting to reform the Security Council by a single EU seat to facilitate the task?
Yeah, well, that's... That would make an interesting answer anyway. I mean, tempting though it is. No, I think the issue I think there are two aspects to this, actually. I do believe that you need some form of bridging mechanism to get around this problem of the UN Security Council and its permanent members. I think it is a problem now. I also think there is, however, a more prosaic thing as well, which is just the actual instruments within the UN could be far more effective. I mean, the fact that you have this multiplicity of agencies that often get involved in, you know, individual issues, there's a lot that we could do for reform inside the UN. And I just think what America and Europe together need to understand is that the UN may not be, and this was part of the purpose of my speech, the UN may not always be the way you get something done, but it retains a fundamental legitimacy and importance in debating at least the framework of action. I mean, for example, if we manage to get an agreement on climate change through the G8+5 dialogue, I mean, that won't be enough unless that is then taken back into the broader and more legitimate, if you like, in terms of its membership, UN institutions. So I think that, you know, I think that we need to address the issue of making multilateral instruments more effective. But I personally think that America and Europe together, a strong transatlantic push to reform the institutions, I think that is something that is long overdue, and I honestly believe it would make an enormous difference to our capacity to get things done. And, you know, I know there's a lot of frustration often within the US about the way that the UN works, and I can understand that, incidentally. I mean, you look at the situation in the Sudan at the moment, and it's hard not to be frustrated. I mean, where is the effective action that there should be? On the other hand, my answer to that is to make it more effective, not to think that we can bypass it in every situation, because truthfully we can't.
Let me take one last question or comment. Yeah.
I'm only doing this because no one else seems willing to ask the last question.
No, sir.
I'm Roger Ferguson, Swiss Re, formerly the Federal Reserve, and you did an eloquent speech on inequality between the developed world and emerging markets. Do you have thoughts on economic inequality and insecurity within the developed economies, particularly as we face globally the question of aging populations?
Well, I think the single most difficult thing we face in any of the developed countries is how you put through a process of radical reform when you've got two issues that I mean, here again, just to offer my thoughts on having done the job of being Prime Minister for these years, I think there are two things that really make life difficult. One is that when you're trying to put through radical reform and change, then the vested interests against that have always got a more compelling story than the people who ultimately will benefit from that change. I mean, I know this is a problem of changing in any institution, but it's true. And you've also got a situation where the taxpayer will not want to pay more taxes, but what they demand from services today is greater than ever before. And then alongside all of that, you have a situation where certainly in countries like ours, you have a situation where you are going to expect more and more from those of working age in order to provide for those of pensionable age with all their difficulties. Now, I don't think there is any way of dealing with this other than quite radical reform programs that involve breaking down monolithic public services, that involve really quite tough welfare programs for people who are of working age and who can work, and a balance between what the state does and what the individual does for retirement and old age. And each one of us in Europe now, I think, is facing similar types of problems, but I guess in America, healthcare and pension reform would also be major issues. And, you know, here's where I think that we can learn from one another. The other really difficult thing in modern politics is that you're conducting these change programs, usually against the background of, you know, some fairly strong things said about how the world is going to come to an end when these reform programs are put through. You've got politicians on, you know, reasonably short-term electoral cycles. It really is helpful sometimes when we are able to say, other countries, we're facing the same challenges, and actually the solutions aren't that different. I mean, I think that one of the things that is interesting about the modern world today is that there is a division, obviously, between progressive and conservative, between left and right. But I think as deep a difference is between those who believe in an open world and those who believe in a closed world, between, you know, the protectionists, the isolationists, the nativists on the one hand, and on the other, the people who believe in free trade, who believe in multilateral engagement, who believe in immigration actually being a great thing for a country's dynamism and energy, not a problem or a disaster for a country. And I think that one of the ways of dealing with change within our countries is to say, look, we are all part of the same process of demographic and economic and social change. And it would help enormously if instead of having a political debate that is about Nirvana on the one hand and Hades on the other, we actually understood that most of modern politics today is people who share the same basic value system in countries like ours, struggling to make change that is difficult but absolutely vital for our future. Thank you.
Prime Minister, may I just... take up the point which you made and put it into a more broader context. We had a number of discussions here during the last days on the issue of identity. And we have in our world, and it was also apparent in your speech, we have to blend different identities, a global, a national, European, local identity. How would you describe your own identity system in this respect? What would be, I may phrase it in the following way, what is the necessary identity in the world or identity systems that we truly work each with another in a harmonious way? And how do you see your own identity system in this context?
Well, I was born in Scotland of an English father and an Irish mother, so I've always been sort of confused, really. I think that within a country like Britain today, which is subject to a lot of migration, as all our countries are, but actually benefits a lot from it, I think the only basis of identity is obviously there are certain shared things for each country, like a shared language and shared tradition and history. But I do come back to this issue to do with values in the end. I mean, I think those are that is the key thing that really binds people together and allows people to cooperate across boundaries. And you know, that's why I say that this concept of open versus closed is, I think, at the heart of a lot of the debates that we have. And I think that for our future to be secure, we need to have that basic common shared value system. But one addition to it, that sometimes when we talk about common values, we talk about freedom and democracy and tolerance, and these are important values. Don't misunderstand me. But these values on their own, I don't think, ever have a powerful enough and persuasive enough effect unless they're allied to a sense of justice. The worst thing about the reaction of some parts of the world to our value system is a belief we don't apply those values in an even-handed way. It's what makes people rebel against the values that actually, if they thought about it, they'd share, but those values lose some of their force by the absence of justice. And that's why it would be a very appropriate way to end my contribution of Davos by saying, you know, of all these issues I've dealt with over these past years, I know all of them. You can't rank them in different importance, but climate change and, you know, the effects of globalization and terrorism, all of these things, absolutely central. But I think we will only secure support for our value system when, if we look at a continent like Africa and see those hundreds of millions of people suffering and in pain, we regard ourselves as almost morally flawed until we have provided the means of changing that situation. And I think it is in that concept of justice that the other values of freedom and democracy and tolerance gain their foundation and their weight.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you also for having us joined us 3 times during your 10 years of in office. I truly hope it was not the last time. We count on you in the future. And on behalf, before I ask Senator John McCain and the co-chairman to join me here, I wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody here,